have the time to sort that out.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Appreciate you helping me. Okay, how are we gonna do that? Do it one more time. That's great. Thank you.
is your first time, someone will give you a text. Does everyone have a text? You good? Okay, great. So just as a reminder, this is a series on a piece of writing by a monk named Menzan, who was a revivalist of the Soto Zen tradition in Japan in the 1700s, and was very important in establishing the kind of central approach to the Buddha Dharma that we consider to be Soto Zen in the modern day. And so part of the reason that we're studying this text is because it so helps us to reflect on the general approach that our school in general takes to the practice of zazen in particular, of meditation, but also approach to just the Buddha Dharma in general. And so we're 5 weeks in, and we've lost a few people and gained a few people. So if you run into anybody that was coming before and they're not coming now, just tell them that the 5th week was the time when you got the secret, and that it's not something that can be discussed outside of class. You make them really jealous. So I want to jump in here, and I have a tendency to go back over everything that I've ever said about anything before we get to new material. I'm going to try to resist that urge, but at the same time, I want to go back to a poem and an image that I was presenting at the end of class last week. And it's this very famous portrait of Dogen Zenji. Probably if you've ever seen a drawing of Dogen Zenji before, the founder of the school in Japan, this is probably the picture you've seen. It's kind of the one that gets used. He's got that kind of funny bumpy head. It's bumpy in the other direction than mine. Mine's kind of bumpy this way, and his is bumpy that way. And he's kind of looking up. He's sort of like this, and he's kind of looking up a little bit, which is interesting because the inscription on that that portrait, he describes himself as a donkey looking into a well. And I'll just read it to you a couple times. An autumn of this aging mountain, fresh and spirited. A donkey looks into the well, white moon floating. One is not dependent, one does not contain. Letting go with vigor, plenty of gruel, plenty of rice. Flapping with great vitality, right from head to tail. Above and below the heaven, clouds and water are free. An autumn of this aging mountain, fresh and spirited. A donkey looks into the well, white moon floating. One is not dependent, one does not contain. Letting go with vigor, plenty of gruel, plenty of rice. Flapping with great vitality, right from head to tail. Above and below the heaven, clouds and water are free. So this image of the donkey looking into the well, I was explaining last week that the donkey oftentimes is a symbol of ignorance or a symbol of delusion. And the horse oftentimes is a symbol of like having arrived or awakening, and the donkey's, kind of the bumpkin. And so here, forgive my drawing, but it's good to kind of, I don't know how to make him look down, but that's the donkey. And he's looking into this well. And in Japan, typically wells on the surface are square. So I was kind of thinking about that today. I tend to think of squares as round. I tend to think of wells as being round. Do you have the image when you think of a well? It's kind of round with a little roof on it and thing. But they tend to be square kind of configurations in Japan, maybe with like stones, a kind of little stone wall that would go around it. So this donkey is looking down into the well. And if we think down in the well here, there's water. And in the sky, there's the moon. And so you think of this image of the donkey looking down into the well and seeing the moon floating in the water. Now, I always hated it when my high school teachers would interpret poetry for me, because there's just something in the image itself that can get kind of broken when you start talking about the pieces too much. But at the same time, I think it bears a little bit of exploration. If you think about, here's ignorance, there's an embodiment of ignorance, is looking down deep into water. Water is usually kind of a symbol of mind. So looking into the well is something about looking into the heart, something about looking into mind. And in that mind, there's this reflection of the white disc, the white disc floating. Said. In this case, probably sounds like a full moon. If it wasn't a full moon, he probably would have said something about the crescent or the horns of the moon or something like that. A full moon particularly is usually a symbol of awakening. So here you have delusion looking into this deep mind and seeing the reflection of the light of awakening. And this must be happening at night, right? Because the moon's out and full. So it's in the darkness. The poem doesn't say, but I think maybe it would be an improvement, is something about the donkey head floating. Because if the donkey can see the moon, the donkey can probably also see the donkey reflected in that water. So the reason I bring this up is Menzan's teaching about zazen is so subtle. And he seems like he says the same thing over and over and over again. I don't know if that's the way you're experiencing the text. And he's not giving us a lot of what feels like direction. Part of the reason for that is he's trying to get us to accept that there is a depth of mind in which delusion and illumination are not separated. That practice, that the life of awakening, the life of a Buddha, is not about separating from delusion. And this is one of the things that makes a poem like this really a master's poem, where he's willing to be a donkey, or at least he's willing that part of himself is a donkey. Right? It's a donkey staring in the well. This comes from a koan that's in the Book of Serenity. I think it's the 52nd one. I read that last week. So this image is known to people, the donkey looking in the well. And so if we want to understand Menzan's recommendation here for the practice of meditation, I think this is a very helpful image. It brings us to what's the question of what is it to look into the mind of awakening. He started out the text by saying what we call zazen is a provisional name for something. And people made a mistake. They saw Buddha Dharma coming from India to China, and he sits facing the wall for 9 years. They call him the Brahma who meditates. And then from there on, which is what Zen means, or Chan in Chinese, they call him the Brahma that meditates, and then the schools that spring from him are known as the Chan schools or the Zen schools, the meditation schools. But Menzan says that was a kind of misunderstanding. They thought he was meditating. He wasn't meditating. He was exhibiting the wondrous mind of nirvana, which was entrusted to each of the ancestors, starting with the Buddha Shakyamuni in the famous sermon where he says nothing. He picks up a flower and twirls it in his hand and says, and Mahakasapa smiles, and he says, Mahakasapa, I entrust to you the wondrous mind of nirvana, the storehouse of the true Dharma eye. So that wondrous mind of nirvana, Menzan's telling us, that's what is provisionally called zazen. So don't think of it as a lever to kind of like hoist yourself into enlightenment. You've got to do something more subtle. You've got to be willing to be a donkey staring in the well, right? And there's all manner of delusion there, as well as awakening. and that's where practice takes place, not just the kind of technique that will, get you beyond your problems, so to speak. So in the first part of the text, he just goes, he goes on and on about that, I think, at length. Anyone ever hang out with donkeys? I haven't very much, but they're cool. I really like them, and I can see why they become the kind of symbol of ignorance or something. But they also seem wise in this kind of way. Like goats are like that too. You're just like goats, but there's something about them that's kind of special. When my wife and I were in Hawaii quite a few years back, on the Big Island, there were all these feral goats, and they were like the coolest animals I've ever met. Because feral means there weren't goats there originally. People brought domesticated goats, and then the goats broke loose, and then they made packs, and so they just look like farm goats, but they're like farm goats that live wild, and there's all this food, so they just can kind of live. I don't know if there's any trouble exactly that they caused, but they were climbing all over the cliffs and everything. So maybe you could be a goat looking into the ocean, would be the Hawaiian version of this. So let's look at page 19. That's where we're starting in tonight. And although Menzan didn't divide this into sections, I've been kind of treating it in sections. And what I said tonight is we'd be looking at pages 19 to 26. And this section I marked off as mind. And so Menzan says, look, this isn't a technique for improving yourself or all of those kind of things. There's something else that needs to happen. Illusion will melt in the face of the light of awakening. And he says, because of that, you should study mind very closely and directly. And then he drops into this section where he's going to say, let's talk about mind. Okay? What do we mean when we're talking about mind? And on page 19, right at the end of that first paragraph, there's not a full paragraph on that page, but the ending of that first paragraph, he says, let's see, it'd be 4 lines up from the bottom. He says, understanding thoroughly that body, mind, and world cannot be grasped with the discriminating mind, that reality is outside of illusory mind, and then releasing the light of the self. Body, mind, and world can't be grasped with the discriminating mind. And that this ungraspable mind, his point is that ungraspable mind is the gateway of practice. Okay, so we want to study that ungraspable mind, not just try to grasp the mind. If we're just trying to grasp the mind, like if we think of meditation as a way to kind of contain something and investigate it by understanding it through discursive thinking and mapping and all those kinds of things, he's saying that's not the point. That this ungraspable mind we want to study in a more direct way, not by containing it, not by grasping it, but by recognizing it's ungraspable. And this is something that you can experience, that you do experience right in zazen. Whether you're thinking of that way or not, it's impossible to grasp mind. It is ungraspable. You can grasp all you want. You can do a whole bunch of grasping in ungraspable mind. That's completely possible and probable. But you will not have grasped mind. You will grasp, but that doesn't mean you've grasped mind. So a lot of the practice in zazen is to realize that the kind of futility of our grasping after mind. And sometimes you'll experience this as deep frustration in zazen. And sometimes feels like liberation, but it's not really two different things. Frustration and liberation. Sorry about that. So let's look into what he presents here when he says, let's look into mind. He starts out with this section, the next paragraph, Again, I'm not going to read everything in here, and I've said this in the past classes, but because there's a few new people tonight, I'll reiterate it. What I'm trying to do is help you develop a relationship with this text. So I don't want to go through like paragraph by paragraph and explain each thing, but take chunks of it and talk about that a little bit, so that when you come back to the text and you're reading it, that hopefully that helps you develop a relationship with it. So in this paragraph, he's talking about a very foundational doctrine within the Mahayana, and that's the doctrine that the three worlds are one mind. Or if we wanted to put that into a less jargony term, we would say all worlds are one mind. So three worlds in this case is kind of talking about all possible forms of existence, of consciousness. And so here he's saying that they're all one mind. But depending on how the activity of karma is flowing, we will come up with a different experience. And this circle that we've been talking about, I've been talking about it as a mirror quite a bit. I'm going to get about it today. He says this is the one mind. We draw a circle because it doesn't really have any edges, but we want to talk about it. So we draw something, that's a circle. If it's a square, like the well, that's a whole other thing about that poem, that if you're kind of interested in what's happening with that, think about there being a square where the circle is the water and a circle in the air, and two circles in the face of the donkey. Think about that. I'll erase it so you don't think about it if you don't want to. In this circle, the really classical teaching is there's a positive side to our karma and there's a negative side to our karma. This is spinning around. That's called samsara, which means life and death, or cyclical existence is how it's described sometimes. So we have this, we're going around and around in circles, and there's considered to be three positive aspects and three negative aspects that can come from greed, hate, and delusion. Does he use delusion or ignorance?
Ignorance.
He uses ignorance.
Ignorance. He says ignorance or greed.
Ignorance or greed?
He says ignorance or greed.
Yeah, so probably he uses these three. So these greed, hate, and ignorance are referred to as the three poisons. So they're the qualities of mind that carry karma or produce karma and keep this whole thing rolling. This is really foundational Buddhism. So a lot of teachers never explain it this way. I really appreciate that he does. Is he says, wait a minute, there's a positive and negative aspect to these. We call them the three poisons. So we usually just only think negative, right? I mean, poison is usually, unless you're an assassin or something, you don't think of it as like a good thing. So, but he really explicitly says it has a positive and a negative expression. So the negative expression, greed, will bring you into the realm of the hungry ghosts. When we've been studying about that as we get closer to Sagaki, or the festival of feeding the hungry ghosts. In the negative aspect, the hate will trap you in hell. Congratulations. And ignorance will bring you into the realm of animals. This is when we're lost in these things in a way that has a kind of negative expression. And he says greed, in the positive sense, is humans. It's the human world. And think about that for a second. We are so practically minded. What separates us from many of the other beings that we occupy this planet with? We're always trying to make things better. And actually, we're pretty good at it. I mean, better is a relative term. But we're like, oh, I've been getting wet every night in the rain. Maybe I'll build a roof. And we have this kind of greed, and it leads us to figuring out how to make things better, how to fix things, how to set things up so that they work well. And he's saying that's a strength. But the real point here is also saying that's limited. Right? It's limited. It's not liberation. It's still part of cyclical existence. If we think about oftentimes how we approach meditation, we think, I'm going to make something good. And as Buddha Dharma was famous for saying, good is just good. It's better to have nothing at all. So the idea that we grasp after or clutch the good, and that creates another kind of a problem. The hate is the asuras, and many times people refer to these four as being negative. And I appreciate that he counts the asuras as positive. Asuras are like, sometimes it gets translated as titans. They're basically heavenly beings that are pissed off because stuff is not divided well. It's not divided equally. That heavenly beings, they're living in a kind of paradise, a forgetful paradise. That's why theirs comes from ignorance. Mostly they're made up of humans that got so good at making things better that they took care of all the problems. And guess what happens when you take care of all the problems? You forget about suffering. And what happens when you forget about suffering? You float off into a celestial realm of forgetfulness. And you can be there for kalpas. But then at some point, and this is really interesting in the text, the first thing that happens, I know I've said this a billion times, so many of you have heard it before, is the heavenly beings smell their own bodies. The heavenly beings is a thought that they live on fragrance. That's what's their nourishment. And there's this turn in their karma. When their karma is ripe to fall, they smell their own bodies. Think about that image of that, being so divorced from your embodiment, and then you're awakened to your karma by smelling your body. Yeah.
It just reminded me of the Genesis story of Adam and Eve when they realize they're naked.
Yeah.
Similar thing, living in paradise and then they realize, it's very interesting.
Yeah. My body.
Mm-hmm.
My body. And so then, they can fall into different places, but often they fall into the realm of the asuras, the technical terms of pissed off gods, okay? The titans. And they're fighting. And in iconography for here, there's a tree that has its roots in the realm of the asuras, but it blooms and fruits in the realm of the heavenly beings. And so there's usually this great war that's happening. The asuras are attacking heaven, and the heavenly beings are defending themselves in some way. Now, Okumura Roshi's notes he says that Menzan refers to these as psychological states, not as actual things. I'm going to take that up with him next time I see him, Okumura Roshi. Because nowhere does Menzan say that. Menzan doesn't even hint at that, other than to say it's one mind. But that's an interpretation that is important. If we think about these just as states that are divorced from us, that's not the point. The point is donkey looking in the well. Right? All of this is there. All of that delusion. All of the different ways, positive and negative, that we try to deal with things. All of the karma, positive, negative, that's moving through this consciousness is present in that looking into mind, which is what zazen is. And it's really helpful for us to realize there's good in that and there's bad in that, but there's got to be something beyond. That's Menzan's main point here. If there isn't something beyond, we're just stuck in this game of going around in circles. And sure, we can make things better, but we're always in the fundamental instability, which is what suffering is about. You think about the kind of anxiousness that you feel in relationship to life. The Buddha, what's the word? What is it when you tell a sickness? Diagnose, yeah. So he diagnosed that and called it dukkha. And he said that's just a mark of living in samsara. Even things that are good, you feel a fundamental instability in them because they don't have a basis. They're always shifting. And so that anxiousness that we feel about them is because we're trying to hold them onto them as a fixed thing. And we try to hold on to something that isn't fixed, that's ungraspable, but we're trying to grasp it. We're trying to fix it. Then we're going to feel anxious. Because even if we don't realize that we can't on our conscious mind, in our deep mind, we know that it's ungraspable. This kind of thing. So that's one side. He says, on the realm of thinking, or in the realm of thought, or this flavor of delusion, there's all these different possibilities about how that may play out. And then he says there's another possibility. A lot of people, they get really excited about just shutting mind down. And he calls that munen or muki. Okay? Muki is the first word he used, and then later on he uses the word munen. Both of those refer to just a negation of thought. And I would say this is like one of the most seductive things about spiritual practice, and particularly meditation, that you can learn, or you can fantasize about having learned, that you could just stop it all. And if you could just stop it all, then everything would be okay. And I'd say particularly within the Zen school, this is a kind of profound sickness. That the non-functioning of mind would be the solution. And so later on in this chapter, when he's talking about the mind as a mirror, he says one of the big mistakes is grasping onto a reflection in the mirror. So that would be relying on our deluded thinking, or I think he says illusory mind. So we see, oh, my life is going so well. I've got everything put together. Or I have a real solution to fix everything. I grab onto that. That's like trying to grab an image that's reflected in a mirror. You can't. Right? So he says that's one mistake. But he says the other mistake is thinking if we could just shut down the illumination, if there just was no images, then there wouldn't be any problem. And he likens that to being attached to the backside of the mirror. Right? He's saying so you realize that there's no solution in grasping after the things that appear in the front side of the mirror. So you just start getting really excited about the backside of the mirror because it doesn't present any problems. Those of you who don't like looking yourself in the mirror in the morning, just turn it around. All problems solved. And he says an interesting thing about that, and that I wanted to clarify. He says when we become attached to no mind, he says we turn into a non-Buddhist or a Hinayana. These kind of words bug modern day people because we're not used to that. We've figured out that sectarianism has lots of problems with it. And so it's right that we feel uncomfortable when we hear those words. So we should look in and try to understand what he's saying. Now, Menzan might have just being a jerk, and could be a good chunk of it. So I admit that. I don't think people being sectarian is, always, they didn't really mean that, they meant this. I don't think that's so helpful, right? I think he did mean to be sectarian, and in a way there's something unskillful about that. But he's also pointing at something very particular. There is an approach to spiritual practice in which we just try to shut down diversity. We think that if we could get rid of multiplicity, that would be the solution. And whether that happens, in some religions that happens through an all-powerful Godhead that consumes everything, and the only reality is the Godhead, and everything else is not important. So that's one approach. But in meditation, the approach tends to be, if I could just get rid of all of this distraction, then that would be the solution. And so we set about this process of trying to kill our thoughts, or to kill the functioning of mind. And he's trying to point at that, and he's saying this is not a Buddhist teaching. So when he says you'll become a non-Buddhist, that's kind of very sectarian way to say that's not the Buddhist path. That's not what the Buddha Dharma is recommending. And when he says that you could become a Hinayana, this is a small vehicle. And the large vehicle or great vehicle, the Mahayana, which the Zen school is part of that wave of Buddhism, has wasted no time to get to criticizing the small vehicle. I mean, that's how you get to be the big vehicle, right? Is you got to have a small vehicle to trash on to become the big vehicle. And there's definitely like a polemic, a kind of like putting down other approaches within Buddhism that's part of that dynamic. But there's also something else. Dogen, I can't quote it exactly where it is, but he says this interesting thing. He says, among the old practitioners, there are plenty of Mahayanists and plenty of Hinayanists. And among those of the great vehicle, there are plenty who are small vehicle people and plenty that are great vehicle people. That's a paraphrase. So so we shouldn't think of it as being about, those Theravadan people are small vehicle people and we're great vehicle people. There's plenty of small vehicle practice within the Mahayana. right? Where we're basically concerned about our own well-being in isolation to other beings. Right? That's what he's pointing out there. When we get focused on just shutting down the mind, it's a very, it's kind of very self-centered thing. And so that's how he's using the word hinayanas there. So you can find in your own self the way that you know, when you hear these kind of criticisms, one thing is like, well, I shouldn't do that, come over here. But maybe the better thing is just see it in yourself. You are definitely going to be a non-Buddhist in a hinayanas. You definitely are. There's no way. Donkey looking in the well. That's part of you. So don't stress about it, but try to wake up to it. See that that is also part of our functioning, and that we should take care of it. It has some wisdom to teach us, but it also is limited. So on page 21, on the bottom of the first of the full paragraph there, 6 lines from the bottom, he says, as you know, I love sentences that start like that. Neither the reflection nor the backside of the mirror is the essential function of the mirror, which, like that of the light, illuminates itself clearly. You must realize that the Buddha's wisdom, like a great and perfect mirror, is far beyond the dichotomy of thought and no thought. As you know, neither the reflection nor the backside of the mirror is the essential function of the mirror, which, like that of the light, illuminates itself clearly. You must realize that the Buddha's wisdom, like a great and perfect mirror, is far beyond the dichotomy of thought and no thought. So this mirror that is self-illumination is both this world of samsara and the world of Buddha wisdom. And that's the point. Now, this kind of total explanation, you know, saying everything is present there, is a very Mahayana kind of explanation. And it's really important. You can't separate out anything. But it also can be a massive trap. And this is something that I don't know, maybe we've talked about in the past lectures too. But if we don't actually look in to the well, but we use this kind of explanation as, we kind of just rely on it as an ontology. In this case, ontology meaning just a kind of description of how things are. Then it's poison, because what it tells us is just like nothing can be done. Everything is just mutually interpenetrating and illuminating. So, end of story. I'm just stuck in whatever kind of, you know, whatever delusion I have or whatever problem I have or whatever suffering is there. It's like, well, that's illumination too. If you focus on it in that way, just as a kind of a description. It shuts things down. And our school is deeply criticized for this by other schools, and rightfully so. It's important to listen to the criticism of other schools, because usually they know what your weaknesses are, right? It's just like as a person, right? Like the people who are willing to criticize you are really, they're a pain, but they're probably telling you something that you need to know. And sometimes they're not, and that's fine. You can sift through that, right? But definitely, I would say that criticisms of the Soto Zen school is often that these kind of beautiful descriptions are just like so many flowers in the mud, right? And they don't really deliver any possibility of transformation. And we really need to hear that, right? Because really, this indivisible mirror, the description of it or the explanation of it in this way, is all about an invitation to look in. So don't worry so much about being a donkey. Don't worry so much about being deluded or enlightened or trying to divide those things out. Actually look into it. Right? and then you'll find that there's no thing called a mirror, right? The only reason there's a mirror is because there's looking into it. Without looking into it, there's no reflection. There's nothing happening. So you've got to look into it, and that's the aliveness of the mirror. There's no independent thing out there. So this leads us to this direction that we've got to study the mind very directly, okay, in an undivided, unleveraged study. And that's why on page 22, Menzan says, not adding any discrimination is the Buddha's wisdom. Okay? Not adding any discrimination is the Buddha's wisdom. He's saying that's what our practice is, not adding any discrimination. He doesn't say there won't be any discrimination there. You look in the well, there's going to be all kinds of discrimination. You see all kinds of weird stuff. I mean, every time you look in the well, do you just like go blank? Do you see all kinds of wild things? Do you plan what's going to happen on the weekend? Do you regret the things that happened before? Are you like, gosh, I'm so sleepy? Are you dwelling on how you're feeling? Whatever it is, probably. And if you're not, there's probably something wrong. You're probably just looking at the backside of the mirror. You're not actually looking into it, right? So, but we don't want that. We don't want to just be caught in our delusion. But he's saying not adding discrimination. Sometimes we say don't put a head on top of the head. Like you got enough problems with the one you got. You don't need to like add another one on there and then dwell on the things that your head are doing. To using mind to cultivate mind, isn't this a great mistake? That's the third ancestor in the verses of faith mind that we chant often. Right? Okay, I want to talk a little bit, at the risk of becoming overly scholarly, I want to talk about the roots of this teaching. Because I think it'd be helpful to see that this isn't just something that Menzan decided was a good idea, that it goes back down to the foundations of Mahayana Buddhism in a text called The Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana, which is attributed to an ancestor named Ashvaghosha, and was one of the key texts that influenced East Asian Mahayana Buddhism. So by East Asian here, I mean China, Korea, Japan. I think Vietnam, at least to some extent. So the Buddhism that was in those places all deeply affected. The Huayan school, the flower garland school, that those of you who were around in the spring, that Shanae did a number of talks on, that school of teaching also deeply prized the awakening of faith in the Mahayana, and its great ancestor named Fatsang, he wrote a commentary on awakening of faith in the Mahayana that became really like foundational to many schools of East Asian Buddhism. And he uses this image of the mirror, and I'm sure it shows up before Ashvaghosha, before the Buddha. I'm sure people were talking about it too. But using the mirror as an image, he describes something I think that's pretty interesting. Now, Ashvaghosha, as a Indian, coming from Indian cultural background, I actually don't know where this was composed. It's attributed to Ashvaghosha, and some scholars believe that it was originally written in Chinese in China. I am not a scholar, so I don't get to use those scholar techniques to make my determination. I think it was Indian, because the way that it's written is so Indian. But it could have been a Chinese monk that was really schooled in the Indian philosophy and then wrote that way. That's possible. It doesn't really matter all that much. But the reason I bring that up is it's very like, there are 4 aspects of this and 3 aspects of this and the 2 subsets of this. And has anyone ever heard the Dalai Lama teach before?
Yeah.
Oh my God. I went to a teaching, his was 2 days long. I could not stay awake. It was great to just be near him, and I loved to watch him speak and everything, but it was like, there'd be like a 10-minute thing he would talk, and then his translator would start translating what he said, and he'd be like, we are on the 75th chapter of the 3rd Tantra of the 17th, and in the 4th turning of the blue wheel, there is a, and it was just like, it was like going down the Roman numeral thing down till you have, I don't know, like 17 little tiny eyes or something, and then he would make a very succinct point there, which I didn't understand because I didn't understand the context of it at all. So that's a kind of quality. Tibetan Buddhism, that was also very similar, at least in some of the schools. In his the Dalai Lama's main school, that's definitely true. So anyway, Ashvaghosha, the awakening of faith in the Mahayana. So he says this. This is the awakening of faith in the Mahayana. So you don't have it. So I'm going to read. Well, you have it. You find it when you get home. But but this is what he talks about with the mirror. The essence of enlightenment has 4 great meanings that are identical with those of empty space, or that can be compared to a bright mirror. So he's saying the significance of enlightenment, right? The meaning of enlightenment. Why enlightenment's important. We can talk about it in 4 different ways. He says the first, the essence of enlightenment is like a mirror which is really empty of images. It is free from all marks of objects of the mind, and it has nothing to reveal in itself, for it does not reflect any images. So he's saying the first thing about this bright mirror, no image can touch it. It is just simply a bright mirror. That's it. And all the reflecting in the world doesn't change the bright mirror one iota. Second, it is like a mirror influencing all people to advance towards enlightenment. That is to say, it is truly non-empty. Appearing in it are all the objects of the world which neither go out nor come in, which are neither lost nor destroyed. All things appear in it because all things are real, and none of the defiled things are able to defile it. For the essence of wisdom is unaffected by defilements, being furnished with an unsoiled quality and influencing all people to advance towards enlightenment. Okay, so now he's saying one aspect, one significance is the mirror isn't touched by any of these things reflected in it. But the other significance is everything is reflected in this mirror. There's nothing that is not present in this mirror. All of the worlds are this one mind, is to say all of the worlds are reflected in this mirror. And nothing is left out. And because of that, it influences people. It influences minds. Because the essence of mind contains everything, the way that mind functions is marked by that. This is a kind of radical thing. That Ashwagosha, there's a term for it called perfuming. He'll say that in other parts of the awakening of faith in Mahayana, he'd say, defilement is just defilement, right? Or like delusion, or illusory mind is just illusory mind. It can't touch awakening, and awakening can't touch it. They're like 2 sides of a piece of paper. You can't get them in the same world. And he'll say, but they affect each other. And the way they affect each other is like if you went into a room where there was a strong scent, this is the kind of metaphor he uses, and you leave the room, you smell like that, right? Now we have all this modern science stuff that says, yeah, the smell's actually little teeny particles and they stick to you and da-da-da-da-da, but that wouldn't have been Ashwagosha's understanding, right? It would have been like, oh, there's just a fragrance somewhere, and being in association with that fragrance, you take on the fragrance. So he says the mutual interpenetration, the fact that the mirror is completely unaffected by all the things appearing in it, right, doesn't mean that it doesn't affect all the things that are appearing in it. And this is the reason I want to bring this up, is because I think this is the really key thing for us to understand about what Menzan is saying. Otherwise, it's like, well, what's the hope? So everything's illuminated. Who cares? Delusion is still just like, we can't deal with it. We could just talk about it being light, but it doesn't stop the pain. Okay, third, it is like a mirror which is free from defiled objects reflected in it. This can be said because the non-empty state of enlightenment is genuine, pure, and bright, being free from hindrance, both affectional and intellectual, and transcending characteristics of that which is compounded. For example, the storehouse consciousness. So this is a lot like the first one. He's saying that the mirror is free from all conditioned things. In the first, maybe he's saying like it's free from all the reflections, and now he's saying, maybe you could say there's nothing can be built in that mirror. Nothing can be grasped, nothing can endure. But it's the fourth one that I really want to focus on. It says, it is like a mirror influencing people to cultivate the capacity for goodness, serving as a coordinating cause to encourage them in their endeavors. Because the essence of enlightenment is free from defiled objects, it universally illumines the mind and induces people to cultivate the capacity for goodness, presenting itself in accordance with their desires. This is a pretty, I think, very interesting thing he says. Presenting itself in accordance with their desires. So this illumination, if we go back to the mirror, the illumination is completely available, and it actually influences all of the beings are there. Just in the same way that we can't grasp things, we're trying to grasp things and we feel anxious because we know that they're ungraspable, even if we don't consciously recognize it, but deep in ourselves we know that we can't grasp them. That is influencing us. The reason we can't grasp them is because they're light. They're not things. They're not things that we can control. They have the freedom of light. And so the very thing that frustrates us in our inability to grasp them is also the very thing that encourages us to turn to them in a different way. So maybe one of the first ways that this illumination or this essence of enlightenment influences us is just to frustrate us with samsaric living. Just to frustrate us. Like dukkha is not the problem. Dukkha is our teacher. The suffering is saying, hey, I don't want to just spin in this. As great as some of the parts are, it's not, there's some other possibility. And so the illumination has an influence. I think, again, when we go back, if we hear this kind of description just as an ontological description, just as a kind of philosophical or kind of cosmological description, and we just rest there, it seems like the light would just be inert. The light's just a fact, but it's part of the picture, right? But what Ashvaghosha is saying here is, no, the light plays a part. The light is doing something. The illumination is, in a way it's just a metaphor, but it's a metaphor of this awakening of mind, which is right at the center of all of us, sometimes referred to as Buddha nature. That's pretty out there. Does that seem out there?
I said, wait.
Way out there, yeah. But again, come back to the donkey. This is why this poem to me, when I first read it, I was just like, man, Dogen frustrates me sometimes.
I don't think it's too far.
Okay, good. But here he's just like, yeah, donkey looking in the well. Right? If you're going to sit zazen, donkey looking in the well. Right? But white moon floating. Don't just take, so it appears according to their desires. When I first read that, I just I'm going to lay down on the floor and flap my body around because I was so happy that it was said in this way. I had an intimation of it, but no one was in it. I kind of like explanations of things. I hate them and like them. It's a love-hate relationship with explanations, as you can tell, because that's what I keep inflicting on you. And then I tell you, don't listen to the explanation too much. But is that it appears according to your desires. This is exactly what's said in the Lotus Sutra. Right? In the Lotus Sutra, it said that there's innumerable meanings. And in fact, he says that in here, right? He says the samadhi of innumerable meanings, the concentration of innumerable meanings. This is this is the samadhi we're talking about with Jijuyu-zanmai. Well, that's within the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha enters into the samadhi of innumerable meanings, and a light is emitted from the curl of hair in his forehead that illuminates all of the Eastern Corridor, or sometimes you could just say everything, and all manner of beings, from the deepest hell to the highest heaven, are illuminated, and all beings can be seen, and all beings can see each other. That is that light appearing to every being in the capacity that they can use it. Right? Other places in the Lotus Sutra, there's the parable of the Dharma rain. That the Dharma rain is just like a rain that falls down on the forest, and it's all the same rain. But every piece of grass, every tree, every frog, everything in the forest uses it to its own capacity. And the rain, it would have its own description of the rain. And that's fine. You have your own description. The white floating disc will be your white floating disc when you look into the well. And I love that encouragement here. That's good. You know, you should have a kind of inspiration to overcome suffering, to overcome delusion. And the mirror's not going to begrudge that. But what the mirror's not going to do is just say, this is what it is, get those guys off the boat and you'll be okay, right? Get those guys off the boat, do these exercises, get strong and spiritually muscular, and then you'll be groovy. What the mirror's going to do is say, yes, it's possible. Keep looking. Don't kick anyone off the boat, right? Stay present. And then you'll have an opportunity to see in the way that the mirror sees, right? Which doesn't reject. Your own eyes are the mirror in that case. One of my favorite teachings on this mind of nirvana, I first heard from Kyogen Carlson Roshi, who's one of the founders of Dharma Zen Center up in Portland. And it's a very old teaching where there's a monk who's trying to explain nirvana to a king. And so he likens it to empty space. He likens nirvana to empty space. Or maybe he would use a bright mirror if he was with us today. And there's a whole bunch of things. You know, he says it's like it doesn't come into existence, doesn't go out of existence, isn't born, doesn't die. Is like the path of birds. That's one of my favorite ones. Because he's saying it's like the sky, right? It's the path of birds. It's the path of the noble ones. Right? One of the things he says is it can't be forcibly handled. So think about how space, there's just nothing, you can't handle it. You can't forcefully handle it. It says it can't be carried away by thieves. That's another one I like. Like, who's the thief in that one? Certainly not you or me. So this cannot be forcibly handled. Think about how these devotees of no thought really just go in to wreak havoc with these teachings of forcibly handling the mind. And that's what in this other part of what we were reading tonight, where Menzan really lays into, says people have misunderstood this, and we've had countless teachers who teach people to get attached to the backside of the mirror and break their mind. And he's really warning against that, and I warn you against that too. This is a kind of easy path to recommend to people, but it leads to real problems. People heard the term spiritual bypassing before? So that's when you do what you think is very spiritual and you use as an excuse to be a jerk. Like it could be a really big jerk or a semi-jerk or whatever, but you just bypassing by, usually it's some kind of doctrine of oneness, right? Which, by the way, the no thought doctrine is great for oneness, because if there's no thoughts, it's just the backside of the mirror, everything's one. Right? So watch out for that. And he's warning us here because this is a continually all-pervasive thing. Now, I'm kind of criticizing it as an exterior thing, like that's the way some people are teaching it, but what I really want to say is it's in your mind, it's in your karma to head in that direction. And so whether you're hearing it from someone who's telling you, yeah, go down that road, like literally in a teaching, or you're just kind of saying it to yourself, watch out for that inclination, because it creates a problem. And then we can't really address our karma in that vein. Okay, I know it's a lot, but I'm just going to keep on going here. You guys are surviving. So page 24. We get to the mood. Were you guys excited to see this? Well, I was excited to see it for a couple reasons. One is because earlier on he's dissing on koan practice, which I told you he wasn't dissing on koans. He was dissing on a very particular way of using koans, and he was saying that there's kind of, you know, people use them as a lever, and that's a problem. That was his point. And I don't think people who really take up koan practice, I think that's one of the things you get disabused. I have never taken up formal koan practice, but for people I know who do, and talking with them, I think it's one of the first functions of a koan practice is to disabuse you of the notion that you will be able to use the koans as a lever, right? Like that's the first thing that you come in with all your clever responses and the teacher just rings you out. Like, so those of you who come to Sanzen here, and like a short Sanzen is like 5 minutes. If you're in a hall that's in koan curriculum, that would be an immeasurably long Sanzen. Usually Sanzen is somewhere between 10 and 30 seconds. If there's really like an interaction, it goes to 30. But sometimes you just sit down and the teacher just rings the bell and you leave. Like it can be that quick, right? And the reason is because there's no messing around with anything other than just what is the heart of this koan. Okay, and then there's different teachers. Some teachers, yeah, they will talk with you for a long time. But I think it's very quick compared to the way that we would tend to practice Sanzen here, or is typical in the Soto school, I'd say. So, so the reason for that is because koans are trying to disabuse you of many of these ideas that we have about what we're going to be doing in practice. And this most famous of koans, Joshu's Mu, is one of those, one such koan. So I was happy it was here because it would prove my point that he wasn't anti-koan. And because he explains it, which is another thing that you don't usually get from a koan. So that's quite exciting. So here, just before that koan, in the paragraph above, right in the middle, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines from the bottom of that first full paragraph on page 24. He says, there is no original mind separate from arising mind. The fuller quote is, although arising mind is a delusion, it is nothing but a sort of temporal form of the original mind. There is no original mind separate from arising mind. And so then, when he comes down here, he in the next paragraph, he says, a monk asked Joshu, does a dog have Buddha nature or not? Joshu replied, no, or mu. The monk asked again, it is said that all sentient beings have Buddha nature. Why does a dog not have Buddha nature? Joshu says, it is because a dog has karmic nature. Now, this is a kind of fine point, but I think it's something that's worth us thinking about. If we think that Buddha nature is something that's contained inside of all of the delusion, we could change this to donkey. Does a donkey have Buddha nature? Right? And then Joshu, well, maybe he would say something different, but let's just say he says mu. And he says, well, I thought all beings have Buddha nature. Why does a donkey not have Buddha nature? And you say, because it has karmic nature. Our tendency is to think that, okay, the dog or the donkey, it can be all of its deluded being, but somewhere inside of there's that Buddha nature. There's like this thing called Buddha nature. As if in this whole world of samsaric turning, there was some jewel. Where do you think? Oh, he's probably in the realm of the animals, right? There's going to be some shining jewel that's contained in there. And if we could just get that jewel, get rid of everything else, we'd be good. That's oftentimes the way we understand Buddha nature. Like, okay, he's a whole bunch of delusion, but at least there's got to be a Buddha nature in there somewhere. I actually think that's an okay way to understand Buddha nature, because just treat people nice. They're Buddhas, right? Try to be as good as you can. You're a Buddha. Like, that's a pretty good teaching. But he's trying to take us somewhere deeper here. And he's saying that it's not that the Buddha nature is contained within the dog. The dog is just nothing but karmic nature. The donkey is just delusion. That's it. But the delusion isn't a problem. The mu is not a denial of Buddha nature. The mu is a denial of our trying to contain the Buddha inside of delusion. That actually the Buddha mind is fundamental. It's not inside of delusion. It is this one. This is why I quoted the thing above. There is no original mind separate from arising mind. So the arising mind is that deluded mind. It's right there with every bit of the dog is the Buddha. Right? So the dog doesn't have Buddha nature. There's no way to have Buddha nature. Right? Dogen, when he discusses Buddha nature, he will say all things entirely are Buddha nature. So this illumination is complete in all of those realms. And Menzan says it this way. He says, this is in the paragraph just below the koan. He says, in the case of the dog, body, mind, and the whole world is the realm of the dog's karmic nature. So there is nothing extra such as Buddha nature. That's what I've been explaining. And he goes on to say, in the case of the Tathagata, this karmic nature is referred to as Buddha nature. That is why when we look from the deluded point of discrimination limited by illusory mind, even the Tathagata's life with perfect virtue seems like nothing but a part of transmigration in the cycle of life and death. Okay? So he's saying the Buddha mind is complete illumination. But from our perspective, we see a Buddha. The Buddha personifies, appears in each one of these realms. Okay? Appears as a thing that we think is like a life. We think the Buddha was born into this world, practiced, was awakened, lived, died, in India 2,500 years ago. That's the story we have. And he's saying that's fine. It shows up like that. Of course it shows up like that. We're donkeys. That's how we see things. But if we pay attention to what we're seeing, there's medicine. There's medicine there. So let me just point out a couple more things, and then we could have a couple questions, and then I'll free you from the onslaught. On page 26, he uses this term. It's in the middle of of the paragraph that continues on from the past page. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In the 6th line down. Actually, I'll start 1, 2, 3, 4, and the 5th line down at the end where it says therefore. It says, therefore, even when our mind becomes evil, if the light of beyond thought is emitted, evil mind will be dropped off immediately, and there will be only the light of the self. So this is what we're going to start talking about in the next class here, is the light of beyond thought. This, what he's translated here as beyond thought, is a term that many of you will know is Hishiryo. So it comes from a famous teaching where Dogen Zenji uses it. It comes from a koan. In his instructions to Zazen, he says we should think, not thinking. What kind of thinking is that? Non-thinking. So this is, I don't want to go into that too much right now, but this beyond thought is the non-thinking. Hishiryo is what it's called in Japanese. So he's saying that Hishiryo, or that non-thought itself, is light. Did you have, were you thinking?
No, it's okay. I just saw something else in the sense.
Oh, great.
And
Whoa! And then in the bottom of that same paragraph, from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines from the bottom, he says this is called the Great Light, the Buddha's wisdom, or Prajnaparamita. This is also known as radiant light from the middle of the forehead in the Muryogi Sho-zanmai, the samadhi of immeasurable meaning, which we were talking about earlier, Zanmai, Ozanmai, the list that he's brought up many times. Okay. So this is called the Great Light, this non-thought, the practice of non-thought. which is not a lever. Dogen says it's thinking, not thinking. That's not thinking. That's what we're being given as the well that we can look into. So, I want to invite you back to the question, what am I supposed to do? Right? I was saying that that's one of the things that is a question that, at least for me, when I study the way that Menzan explains this, where I get frustrated with it, I say like, well, yeah, but there's all this kind of explanation here, but what am I supposed to do? And again, all of us can be so many flowers in the mud, which isn't horrible. That happens, flowers fall, there's mud. But it doesn't really transform. It doesn't really, to just be on that level of explanation. So part of the reason that I appreciate the way Menzan teaches like this is because it brings us right up against that conundrum, rather than just giving us something to do, rather than just saying, okay, yeah, just do this. Use your good, well-honed human mind to fix the problem, and I'll give you a good technique. He's saying, no, we've got to stay right there with the deep discomfort of not being able to use our human approach to overcoming problems. If we want to be able to use the Buddha's wisdom, or we want to be able to wake up to the Buddha's wisdom of overcoming this kind of suffering. And so I find it kind of frustrating within our school, but I also feel like it's really important. And it is like kind of facing a wall sometimes, which we do, right? And which Buddha Dharma did. And there's something that just seems so immovable about it, which is true, but can be helpful. And so I might say that the provisional name for that conundrum of what I'm supposed to do is zazen. So you sit down. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Well, sit down. What am I supposed to do? You sit down. Not because the sitting down is the solution to the question, what am I supposed to do? But it's your opportunity to look in the well and ask that question, what am I supposed to do? And then that moment provides some other kind of opportunity. So for the next class, we'll go into that a bit with the next section I titled the Samadhi of the Tathagata, or the practice of the Buddha. That goes from pages 26 to 31. So if you're reading along there, you can pull that out. We probably have time for a question or two if anyone has them. It's fine if not, too.
I will try to say something that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'll try. So in my experience, study of self is a very rational process. You go through these varying rituals of zazen and what have you, and coming back to it over and over again, maybe thousands of times. You start to uncover all these things which are articulated very rationally in this text, and by you here, it makes sense. There's some order to it. Now you could debate some of the kind of mythology in a system like this about the realms and such, but putting that aside, there is a very rational bent to this whole thing. It makes sense, and also it aligns with science very, very clearly. I think that you can make a very strong argument that articulates sort of a symmetry that's there. However, the more you study, the more you see the well looks back. Mm-hmm. And in that, I find there is no relation to science anymore. Mm-hmm. And there is no relation to sort of any rationality in that process. Mm-hmm. And so when I look into that question really deeply, the things that sort of make sense are like, basically like asking questions of myself over and over again, like things like, do some of the teachings in Abrahamic faiths around God mm-hmm. and around sort of the relationship to that actually make more sense? Mm-hmm. And I mean, I could go on and on about this. There's so many lines of like, that's just one small example. There are many articulations of this kind of breaking of rationality in favor of mythology that make, in fact, more sense to dealing with this problem of, you know, how do I actually respond to this thing? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I feel like there's nothing there that's really, I mean, this is very weird, I guess the way to say it. I mean, you glanced over it, asked this question, this sounds strange. This is really strange.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't follow any of the things you'd expect. You'd expect it just to sort of end at interpenetration.
Yeah.
But it doesn't.
Because interpenetration is an explanation. And if we dwell in the explanation, we can keep it rational. But if we actually look in, then it will be weird. And that, and by that, what I mean by that is you don't look in and then expect, okay, I'm going to see ghosts or whatever. But don't be surprised if you do. And that gateway is I think what you bring up is really important. Because Menzan uses such a kind of very rational approach here, he's trying to bring us to something. And he's explaining all this stuff to help bring us to something. But it itself can kind of just end in explanation without that looking in. That was one of the reasons that last week I was bringing up this issue of being seen by the Buddha, because that koan that I had read last week, that case 52 in the Book of Serenity, where the teacher says it looks back, right? And that's really hard for us to deal with in a kind of rational materialist sense, because up until now we can break all this down in that kind of very rational way. But once we start appreciating the personhood of other beings, now there's something else on the table, and that other beings can be seeing us, and some of them are human and some of them are not human, or they show up in different realms. And that part is why actually most of the stuff I teach from is not so rational like this, because I feel like we have to go to that level of mythology to be able to get it. I think a little bit later in the text now, when he starts talking about the Tathagata and what is the nature of a Tathagata and the practice of a Tathagata, which is an epitaph for a Buddha, then we start getting into that a little bit more.
In a similar way, maybe riffing off of where Rokon was going with that, you were talking so much tonight about the joyfulness and excitement of being the donkey.
Yeah.
And looking at this behind your head is the six realms,
Yeah.
and how, in a sense, we so love talking about the light of the mirror, but it seems like what the subtlety of what Menzan is pointing to is the opacity of the image, and how it means to the ignorance of the animal, and to live in accordance with the desires of the ignorance of an animal. And in each of the realms there's a Buddha appearing. And so when you're in the hell realm, what does it mean to suffer without adding any discrimination?
Right.
And in each of those places, performing the mirror of the Mahayana, but specifically, not abstractly, and the myriad kinds of yearnings and sufferings and frailties and strengths that you are drug through, rather than choosing or some viewing of.
That's one of the reasons I think that teaching is so important, because we want to lift off from embodiment. And I don't mean just like our physical embodiment. I mean just the actuality of our lives. We are so we so want to lift off of it because it contains these sufferings. And so a lot of spiritual inspiration comes from a desire to lift off of those things. And one of the things I appreciate so much about Buddhism is that it says, no, we have to, just like you're saying, the specificity of the sufferings of this life, of the embodiment of this life, are absolutely necessary for encountering the luminosity. There's no getting rid of them. And even the Buddha didn't leave them in his awakening. That's the thing we have to really pay attention to that. The Buddha didn't, I know I've said this a billion times in this class, the Buddha didn't wake up underneath the Buddha tree and then say "Ooh, I'm out of here." The Buddha stayed. How crazy is that? I mean, the stories tell us that he sat there for a long time being whoa. That's how I interpret it. Just nah, there's what, and then it said that that some divine beings begged him to teach. And he said, the people won't understand. And so it doesn't matter if people understand. You have to teach anyway. And I think that's really what's his awakening. Yeah. When he stood, we say that's when the Dharma wheel started to turn, when he stood up from beneath the Bodhi tree. And when he stood up from beneath the Bodhi tree, then all of the mistake of all of our lives in the Dharma began. And but that's hallelujah, right? You know, like the specificity of our own delusion could be met, and then the Buddha stayed with the Sangha, and then the Buddha entered parinirvana and didn't go anywhere, and still is here, you know, teaching us, and that's sort of inspiring to me. And this is part of what maybe this is the last thing I'll say, and then we have to close is, in this, part of what the Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana is doing is Ashwaghosa's attempt to reconcile a whole bunch of different teachings. And in the Yogacara teachings, which are teachings on the structure of mind, the deepest level of mind in most schools is called the alaya consciousness, which means storehouse. And this storehouse is said to be the perfect reflector and storer of all activity. So that anything which sentient beings do, think, intend towards, see, anything, leaves a mark here. But that's a little not quite right. Leaves a mark. Because this essentially is a mirror. No mark can get left there. It only gets reflected. It's called a mark because it appears in the mirror, and this is a place that can't be seen in this Yogacara. There's a couple levels that are just below the threshold of consciousness, and then you get into a place that sometimes parts of it is, and then you get into places that are part of our normal conscious mind. So this all stuff is happening below the threshold of not just consciousness in general, but the capacity for consciousness to see directly. So all the stuff that's happening is bouncing up. It's reflecting in and out, and we think things are just happening, but actually there are those reflections of what's happening from down here into life. The reason I'm bringing that up is in this school of Buddhism, the understanding is that for Buddha, the full awakening of Buddha, this storehouse becomes a mirror. It's called the Great Perfect Mirror of Wisdom, or the Great Round Mirror of Wisdom. And it's not that anything changes, it's just that the Buddha wakes up to what's going on, is that this is just total reflection, and that all of the delusion of beings is right there, inseparable from the deepest qualities of illuminated mind. And to me, that's just that's the good news of the Mahayana. I mean, it's kind of the good news and the bad news. You don't get to escape it, but you get to do something better than escape it, which is to see the truth of it, and to live out the integrity of not turning from suffering, but facing it with your whole heart. Okay, that's my story. I'm sticking to it. We're a little over time. So remember, there's no class next week. We're in meditation. We don't know what to call them. They're called sesshin. Intensive retreat, frontal attack, intensive, whatever. Lots of retreat, lots of sitting next week. So there won't be class, but you're welcome to come and sit. So the sitting starts at 6:45, and there's 3 periods, and usually there's a talk in the evening. So if you want to come and sit, those periods are open in the evening. But there won't be class, and then the week after that there'll be class. There'll be 3 more classes. Originally had scheduled 9 classes, but my wife had a little change in when she needs to travel to Japan. So the last class, which I think was just after Thanksgiving, we won't be having class that day.
Yami